Okay, so welcome everyone. I'm Loïc Marviel from the University of New South Wales, Sydney, land of the Bidigal people, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past and present. Lauren Liziecki from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and myself are today's convener for this webinar, which is the sixth in a series organized by Climate of the Past as part of the journal celebration of its 20th anniversary. Climate of the Past is an open access journal of the European Geosciences Union. So the webinar will include two presentations of about 25 to 30 minutes and will conclude with about 30 minutes of question. Please include your question in the chat. So as a reminder, all the webinars are recorded, and thanks to the EGU office, they are uploaded to the EGU YouTube channel, so you can catch up on all the talks that you missed and also find this one maybe in a few weeks or so. Please remember to stay muted during the whole time of the presentation, and maybe it might be best to turn your camera off during the talks as well. Okay, so today's topic is past ocean circulation and climate change. So this webinar will explore the relationship between ocean circulation and climate change. The invited talks will provide new evidence of change in deep water formation or change in surface circulation and how they impacted global climate and the carbon cycle. Our first speaker is Helen Bostock, who is professor in the School of Environment at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia. Prior to joining the University of Queensland, Helen worked at the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, NIWA, in New Zealand, and at Geoscience Australia. Our research focused on oceanography and paleoceanography of the ocean around Australia. Using stable isotopes, geochemical traces, sedimentology, and microfossils, our research aimed to understand present and past changes in ocean chemistry to reconstruct ocean circulation changes and its relationship to global climate. So today, Helen will talk to us about carbon isotopes in Planktic foraminifera. So Helen, please.
Okay, thank you, Laurie and Lorraine and the organisers of the series of talks. It's a great honour to be asked to give a presentation. Today I want to kind of revisit carbon isotopes in Planktic foraminifera. Basically, we collect a lot of carbon isotopes when we run our oxygen isotopes on foraminifera. We get 2 for 1. And yet, a lot of the time, we mostly publish the oxygen isotopes, and a lot of people ignore the carbon isotopes. So I guess I want to make a case for going back to those carbon isotopes that are sitting there and maybe have a look at them and see if we can learn more about the carbon cycle from these Planktic carbon isotopes. I am a paleoceanographer who works on sediment cores, and as Laurie said, I have mostly focused my research on the South Pacific, working in the waters around New Zealand and Australia, but also down towards Antarctica and thinking about the carbon cycle in the Antarctic Southern Ocean area. So just a reminder that, as paleoceanographers, one of the things we're interested in is this carbon cycle and how the ocean really is dominating the carbon cycle. The oceans hold up to 93% of all the readily accessible carbon, and the atmosphere only 2% and the biosphere about 4%. But what we're interested as paleoceanographers is really the distribution of carbon between the atmosphere and the ocean, and also where the carbon is stored in the ocean, whether it's stored in the surface waters, in the deep waters, how it exchanges between the atmosphere and the ocean, we think is what controls the climate cycles, these glacial interglacial cycles, and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere is really dependent on how it's exchanging with the ocean and being taken up or released from the ocean. So given carbon isotopes have a very strong relationship with the total carbon in the ocean, so there's a tight relationship between DIC, or dissolved inorganic carbon, and the carbon isotopes. Carbon isotopes are quite a powerful tool to understand this climate cycle, this carbon cycle over longer periods of time, as well as the modern as well as in the past. So a quick 101 to remind us all of how the carbon isotopes tend to be distributed through the ocean. And so we have carbon dioxide taken up by between the atmosphere and the ocean across this equilibrium between the two. And there's a number of other processes that also influence the carbon cycle and, of course, the carbon isotopes. So at the air-sea interchange, we have exchange of CO2, which actually impacts the carbon isotopes. So in colder waters, we tend to have more enriched carbon isotopes, carbon-13, versus in warmer waters, we have more reduced carbon-13. We also have biological processes where, of course, photosynthesis takes up more carbon-12, which leaves behind carbon-13 enriched surface waters. And then as our organic matter sinks to the deep ocean, it remineralizes, releases the carbon-12. And so in the deep waters, we tend to get carbon-13 depleted waters, so more carbon-12 enriched waters. And that gives us a kind of classic depth profile that looks like we have high carbon-13 in the surface and low carbon-13 in the deep, or enriched carbon-12 in the deep. But of course, that's only where we have this process of the biological pump sinking down the carbon. If we have ocean circulation, both at the surface or at the depth or upwelling, then of course this classic depth profile of the carbon-13 changes. And we can actually kind of look at this in the past because we have foraminifera. And occasionally near the coasts, we also have to take into account terrigenous detritus. So sometimes we have these slightly enriched carbon-12 just because we have a lot of organic matter coming off the land. So we have to be a bit careful in the coastal regions. But I like to call this the ABCD of carbon isotopes, just to remind myself of all these different processes that we need to disentangle to really understand what's happening to the carbon cycle in the ocean. So if we look at the carbon-13 in the water today, so we can measure it in the water. The nice thing with carbon isotopes is we can measure it both in the water today, but we can also look at it in the forams in the past. So it's one of the few proxies that kind of can be relatively easily measured both today and in the past. And in some ways, that makes it easier to compare the modern processes with the past. So here we've got the carbon-13 of DIC in the Atlantic Ocean, and we can see that it's elevated in the North Atlantic deep water and slightly more negative in the Antarctic intermediate waters and Antarctic bottom waters. And so we can certainly use it as a tracer of deep water circulation, and these deep waters mix this classic profile of high to low carbon-13. We also know that it's strongly related to the nutrient cycle, and so carbon isotopes can also provide us with information about nutrients as well as ocean circulation. If we look at it from the Pacific Ocean, we can see that actually the Pacific Ocean is where most of the carbon is stored today. We get the lowest carbon-13 values in the North Pacific deep waters and the Pacific deep waters, and that's also shown in the high nutrients in those North Pacific. So these, modern ocean, we know how the carbon sits, where the carbon sits, and we can use the carbon isotopes to sort of understand these modern processes. But of course, it's long been used to also understand how it's changed in the past. So this is the paper by Curry and Oppo, but was a update on previous work by Duplessis and others from the 1980s, where they looked at carbon isotopes in the water using the original geosex data, and then they looked at carbon isotopes in the benthic forams, and they reconstructed the AMOC, the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, to show that it changed quite considerably in the past. So we've used carbon isotopes in benthics a lot to understand this deep water ocean circulation, but we haven't really looked at what's happening in the surface waters, or at least there's been a few studies, but there's a lot more that probably could be done in the surface waters. So can we use the carbon isotopes in the planktic forams to really understand better the air-sea exchange and the exchange between the deep waters and the surface waters much better, and understand that upper part of the carbon cycle? So we're pretty good with the lower part based on the benthic forams, but let's think about how we can understand what's happening in the upper part of the water column. So to do that, we have to have a pretty good understanding of planktic foraminifera ecology, the depth that these forams sit at, whether they have symbionts, whether they're autotrophic or heterotrophic. We need to understand their seasonality and their life cycle. And if we have that understanding, we can use these different planktic forams to try to reconstruct the carbon cycle at these upper depths in the water column, in the upper like 600 meters or so. And then we can start to link more easily with the benthic forams that typically don't get measured in the really coastal regions, but typically tend to be offshore in the deeper than 600 meters or so. So let's have a think about how we can use them a little bit better to understand these upper water processes. There's been a lot of progress, I would say, in the last decade or so on understanding the planktic foram ecology and depth ranges, and this recent database, the FORSIS database, has come out, which has looked at all the sort of modern foram distribution, but also thinking about seasonality using things like ocean traps, sediment traps, but also these multi-nets that can take in plankton toes at different depths, so we can think more carefully or have a better understanding of the depth range of these forams. So we've improved our understanding quite considerably of the foram ecology in the last decade or so. And of course, all of this ecology is actually really important, because when we measure the carbon isotopes in the forams, what we find is that they don't necessarily directly relate to the delta 13C in the DIC of the water, because there are these various biological factors or vital effects that alter the carbon isotope values. And that's been known for a while. A lot of work was done in the 80s and 90s to try to understand what was causing these vital effects through experiments in the lab, through plankton toes, sediment traps, and measuring the carbon isotopes from live forams where we know where they were living, to understand what was driving these carbon isotope offsets. So we know that temperature can cause an offset, whether they have photosymbionts, what type of food they're eating, or what the organic delta 13C of the food is, and things like the carbonate ion concentrations. So we can measure them. This is kind of, if we look at a range of forams in the water column and we measure their carbon 13, we get this top graph, and this is paper by Howie Spiro from 2003, where he measured a range of different forams and then corrected them for these offsets. And you get a slightly more spread out change in what we can see as things like the ruber and sacculifer, because they have symbionts, typically have much lower carbon-13 when they're first measured because of the symbionts, metabolic effects. But when we correct for them, then they go much higher, which is more typical of the surface waters where we expect to get the high carbon-13, because these are shallow water or shallow living planktic forams that live in the upper 100 to 200 meters. And so when we correct for them, we get a better understanding of how the water column carbon-13 might be distributed in that upper few hundred meters. And we can then get a sense of how well mixed, how stratified these layers are. And in conjunction with the oxygen isotopes, we get a sense of this upper layer mixing, but also exchange of carbon with the atmosphere. So I wanted to just quickly run through, I guess, an example we published in 2019. So this was a master's student of mine who basically, I had a lot of carbon data sitting in my bottom drawer, and this master's student, I challenged him to kind of pull it all together and try to understand with me, in collaboration with me, to try and make sense of what's going on in the Southwest Pacific, where we had core tops representing sort of the modern day, but also some down core, 19 cores of data down core covering the last 20, 30,000 years. But we wanted to also look at the modern surface waters to also understand what's going on there, to compare these core tops to, and then the down core. So it's a complicated region, the Southwest Pacific. We've got a lot of different, we go from these warm subtropical waters, subtropical surface waters, STSW, through the subtropical front, into the subantarctic surface waters, past the subantarctic front down into the surface waters of the Southern Ocean. So we have a really dramatic gradient here, which makes it kind of interesting to test how the carbon isotopes vary across this range. So we can see there's a strong temperature gradient, but there's also a strong surface salinity. Temperature also influences, of course, the oxygen. And we also have a very strong nutrient gradient with low phosphate in the surface waters, in the subtropicals, but very high phosphate down in the Southern Ocean. And so how does that influence the carbon isotopes? So looking at a transect just east of New Zealand, the P15 transect, if people are aware of the World Ocean Circulation Experiment transects, we can see that we've got a pretty good understanding of these delta 13C in this. I'll just zoom in. The delta 13C, so we can see down in the southern parts, we have the Southern Ocean with our circumpolar deep water, but also these surface waters. And then we have the subduction of the Antarctic intermediate water. And this is where we sort of get the subantarctic front, and then around 40 degrees or so south, between 45 and 50, we get the subtropical front. And so we've got a pretty good understanding of what's happening in the depth transect. But when we looked at the surface data along the different World Ocean Circulation Experiment transects, it was pretty patchy. And I can tell you that when we did a bit of an interpolation, it was sort of all over the place. So we started to tease it out by different age of the transects for these surface waters. And I found some really old 1970s surface data. So this is the yellow line here. So this is actually from 150 west here, that yellow line. And then the purple and blue line is the 1990s for the purple and blue for the 2000s along this 170 west. And what we can see is that in the 1970s, carbon isotopes were quite a bit higher. 1990s had dropped, and then by the 2000s, they had dropped further. We'll come back to these red, green, and black lines in a minute. And basically what we can see quite clearly in the surface waters is we have the influence of the Zeus effect. And so carbon isotopes in the atmosphere are declining because we're burning fossil fuels and putting more carbon-12 into the atmosphere. And therefore, what we're seeing is this exchange, air-sea exchange with the surface waters is reducing the carbon-13 in the surface waters across the ocean. So the surface waters of the ocean are significantly impacted by this, which means that they're not necessarily the best way to compare to the down-core data. But to get a better understanding of the carbon isotopes in the surface waters and how much exchange is going on, we took the 2000s data, so all the data from 2003 to 2014 across a few different world oceans circulation transects, and we developed a multiple linear regression using oxygen, temperature, density, and salinity to kind of interpolate that limited carbon-13 data that we had for the surface waters across the whole of the region. And we got a pretty good R-squared, and our residual values were not too bad. Better in the depth, a bit broader or a bit wider in the surface. And so what we came up with is for the 2000s, this is, I guess, a better understanding of, we looked at it for different seasons. So here's the spring season, which basically shows that we have this peak in carbon isotopes in the sort of subtropical front down to the polar front, but really peaking around the subtropical front and subantarctic front, with low values to the north in the subtropical waters and low values to the south in the Antarctic waters because of your upwelling of deep waters to the surface. And so we can then start thinking about what's driving that carbon-13 in the surface waters today. And so you can separate out the biological processes versus the air-sea processes. And we can see that while biology basically is the dominant value, because we've got the higher values of 1.7, 1.8 here, the air-sea surface values, although much lower, are actually probably controlling the pattern of the carbon isotopes much more strongly. Then we removed the Zeus effect using the approach that Olsen and Ninnemann and Edey published a few years ago. We removed that, and so we got back to what we think is the pre-industrial carbon isotopes for this region. And we can see that they're significantly larger, around 3 now, and 2.5 to 3 now across this high range in between the subtropical waters and the subantarctic waters. And so just to show you what it's like today, we can see that there has been this decline since the 1990s of the carbon isotopes in the surface waters. So that's the green and the black lines here are these pre-industrial carbon isotope values. In red here is the core top value. So we had about 70 core tops across the region. And of course, it's a complicated region. So the subtropical front and subantarctic front are kind of not just single lines. They cover a bit of a broader area. Also depends whether you're west or east of New Zealand. So it's not probably the easiest case study to have done. But what's interesting is pre-industrial works fairly well for the low latitudes, but actually the approach of using CFCs to remove the Zeus effect in the south of 50 is probably overestimating the amount of anthropogenic influence. So it probably isn't working so well down here. But what's interesting is that the 1970s, the core tops tend to actually follow fairly well or agree fairly well with the 1970s values. Remember that the 1970s values are off in the Pacific, a bit further away from New Zealand than where the core tops are. A similar kind of peak in carbon isotopes is seen in the South Atlantic. So this is a paper by Julia Gottschalk from 2015, where they showed a similar sort of peak in this brown line here of the planktic of the carbon isotopes in the surface waters, and then their corrected core top values also show a peak like we see in the South Pacific. So it seems to be, replicated around the Southern Ocean. We have to correct in boloides what's been found. So here we're looking primarily at Globigerinoides boloides, sorry. And it has been shown with sediment traps and from around the world that it is strongly influenced. The carbon isotopes are strongly influenced by temperature. So we corrected it for temperature, and that's that red line that you saw on the previous one comparing to the surface oceans. We also corrected the down core. So here we had 19 different cores going back to 25,000 years, and we corrected the measured carbon isotopes for their temperature as well. And for each region, we stacked all the data and ran a Monte Carlo, because carbon isotopes tend to be a little bit noisier than oxygen isotopes. And so while in this example, they sort of generally agree, we decided to run a sort of Monte Carlo approach by combining 5 different cores and putting in the errors of both the carbon isotopes and the errors of the age model to get a better representation of how the carbon isotopes in this region have changed through time. And we did this for 5 different regions, from subtropical waters, subtropical front, and back down into subantarctic waters. And we can see that in some regions, like this area, the data didn't agree quite so well. And so, maybe we can't make much of the Monte Carlo approach here, whereas in other regions, we got a much better fit. So some regions, and this region, this North Chatham Rise, has quite a lot of terrigenous input. So maybe it's being a bit more impacted by detrital carbon coming in as well that might be influencing that region, or more complex oceanography that we haven't really taken into account. We then split it into some 2K time slices, and basically what we found is that that peak in carbon isotopes, which sits around 45 degrees south today, you can see in the red, black, and yellow. Here is the last Holocene data. So this 2K time slice during the Holocene, we see this peak at 45 degrees, but actually during the glacial up until about 13,000 years ago, the peak in carbon isotopes was actually sitting more like 40 degrees south. So it seems like the shift in that peak in carbon isotopes has significantly shifted north, which fits with a lot of other data that we have on temperatures and on the subtropical front shifting due to southern hemisphere westerly winds in the Southern Ocean. Just another brief, quick example is here is an example of using a slightly deeper foram, Globigerinoides truncatonoides, which sits at about 500 meters, and how when we compare the carbon isotopes, so this delta 13C, this is between Globigerinoides truncatonoides delta 13C and the benthics, we see that basically at each of the deglaciations, we see this dramatic decline to almost zero offset. So it suggests a much greater upwelling from the Southern Ocean, from the benthics basically then sit directly on top of these 500-meter Delta 13C, so clear upwelling signature. And there was a recent paper by Aidan Starr that showed the same thing offshore South Africa. So all across the Southern Ocean, there's sort of now this evidence that we get this really quite dramatic upwelling from various processes, from radiocarbon, from carbon-13, showing that the carbon is being released from the deep waters and brought up to the surface waters. So, the carbon isotopes can tell us also about things like upwelling. Okay, where's the mouse gone? Okay. And I just wanted to highlight that we do have a atlas of quaternary foraminifera isotopes. This was put together by Stefan Molitzer with a whole bunch of collaborators from around the world. And here is the current sort of distribution of all the quaternary isotope data that we have put into this database. And it may have been updated since 2022. But what was interesting is that almost half the data is actually Planktic foram data. And here's the carbon-13 ones. We've got quite a lot of Ruber, which is a tropical one, Beloides, which I've just been talking about, and which is a temperate one, and Pachyderma, which is more a polar one. So, more than half of the data is actually Planktics in the database. And if you plot the Planktic carbon-13 by latitude, we certainly see in the red is the Planktics, red and orange. We certainly see, some clear sort of trends. This is including all Planktics thrown together. So we probably want to unpack this a bit more and look at different Planktic species and see how they are showing these trends at different latitudes. Of course, this also involves all the downcore data as well. So, thinking about unpacking this data set a little bit more and maybe understanding these carbon cycle in the upper part of the water column a little bit better. So I guess this is a kind of, let's maybe take a closer look at all this archived carbon-13 Planktic data that's there, and maybe we can get a better sense of what's happening in these upper mixed layer depths of the ocean with respect to the carbon cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. If you have questions for Helen, please put them in the chat. And we'll do questions for both speakers at the end of the session. Okay, so now I'm going to be introducing our next speaker, Sam Sheriff-Tadano, whose talk is entitled Isolating Feedback Mechanisms to Unravel Glacial Climate Variability. Sam is a climate ice sheet modeler whose work focuses on the interactions among ice sheets, atmosphere, and ocean. During his PhD at the University of Tokyo, he investigated how continental ice sheets influence atmospheric and oceanic circulation using a complex climate model. He also examined the drivers of millennial climate variability with particular attention to the role of sea ice. As a research fellow at the University of Leeds, he carried out ensemble simulations of coupled ice sheet climate systems to assess how uncertainties in model parameters affect ice sheet behavior. He's now based at the University of the Ryukyus, where his research centers on the understanding the dynamics of sea surface temperature variability in the northwestern subtropical Pacific from past climates to future projections. So thank you, Sam. And I think you need to put your PowerPoint in projection mode, I think.
Okay. Give me a sec.
Yes, that looks great. Thanks.
Okay. There you go. Thanks for the introduction, Lauren, and thanks for having me today. It's a great honor for me to be being able to attend and give a talk in this Climate of the Past 20th anniversary seminar series. And I first like to congrats the journal for contributing a lot in advancing the science of past climate changes. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure it's going to be a great journal for the next coming decades, or maybe on a centennial timescale. And in this talk, I'm going to discuss some of the mechanisms of the glacial millennial climate variability using a complex climate model. Okay, so my talk is divided into 3 parts, the first of which is a brief personal review on the history of the simulation of geocycles with complex climate models. And then I'd like to talk about some of the mechanisms, focusing on the role of Southern Ocean. And if I have some time left, I might show some results from the effect of the feedback of the North Atlantic surface winds. Okay, so from polar ice core data, we now have a good understanding what the millennial climate variability was over the last glacial period. And these 2 lines show the Greenland and Antarctica Delta 018 record, showing abrupt warming at the onset of interstadial over the Greenland, followed by a gradual cooling, then an abrupt shift back to the cold stadial. On the other hand, over the Antarctica, we can see a gradual cooling during the interstadial, then a gradual warming after the shift into the stadial. I think there are quite a few questions we want to answer about this millennial climate variability, but one of the important questions would be to answer what is sustaining or what is driving this millennial climate variability other than Skødårlige cycles. And also, if you have a closer look at each geocycle, you may realize that the shape of each geos are quite different. And it also would be important to understand why we see this kind of large variety in the real observed geocycles. So from lots of effort from the proxy side and also from the theoretical studies, we now have a good understanding that drastic changes in the geocycles are related to large variabilities in the AMOC. These 2 panels compare the schematic of the AMOC during the stadial on the left, during the interstadial on the left and stadial on the right. During this interstadial, we can see a strong northward flow carrying heat to the higher latitudes and maintaining the sea ice edge at the higher latitude, keeping the Greenland in a warm state. On the other hand, this northward transport of heat is going to cool the Southern Ocean and the Antarctica, known as the bipolar seesaw. Once the surface water gets cold enough, it starts to sink due to the density and then returns south at mid-depth. Below this AMOC cell, you can see some northward intrusion of Antarctic bottom water. Once the AMOC shifts into the cold mode, the climate also shifts to the stadial, and during this period, the AMOC gets shallower and weaker, meaning a weaker northward heat transport. As a result, the sea ice can expand southward, and that's going to maintain a very cold climate over the Greenland. On the other hand, looking at the deep ocean, you can see some more northward intrusion of the Antarctic bottom water, filling up the deep Atlantic basin. So after knowing this kind of event happening over the last glacial cycle, I think it would be normal for climate scientists to want to understand its driving mechanism. And in doing that, it's very important to reproduce such climate changes with complicated climate models, which have lots of complicated physics. However, I mean, even if we want to start understanding the mechanism and trying to reproduce the simulation of the geocycles. That's not easy, and so we have to do some simulations one by one. And in this regard, in my understanding, the first ever glacial climate and AMOC simulations in the PMIP context was conducted in 2007. And figures on the left show the summary of the simulated AMOC for the modern climate on the top and LGM climate on the bottom. So Betty and others show that while most climate models show a similar AMOC for the modern climate, the responses of the AMOC at the LGM had large variety, like some of them showing deeper AMOC, some of them simulating shallower AMOC. However, because of this variety, people were able to learn what's controlling the glacial AMOC strength and its dynamics. Viven and others published a paper in 2007 in Climate of the Past, showing a strong relation between the changes in the AMOC strength between the LGM and PI on the y-axis to the changes in the density contrast of the AABW and NADW on the x-axis. So what they show is that if a model simulates a denser AABW, saltier AABW at the LGM due to more sea ice formation, then that model can simulate a weaker and shallower AMOC consistent with the proxy data. So from this type of simulations, we were able to learn that our glacial AMOC is controlled by the balance of the South and North Atlantic, which makes sense. Having this kind of LGM simulations allowed people to do more fun sensitivity experiments like hosing or deglaciation. Figure on the left summarizes the response of climate to freshwater hosing in the northern North Atlantic. And each panel is sharing the result from a different model. For example, when we apply freshwater hosing mimicking ice sheet retreat in the northern North Atlantic, that causes a drastic cooling in the northern hemisphere related to the expansion of the sea ice, whereas the Southern Ocean and Antarctica warms gradually related to the bipolar seesaw. Some studies also did the deglaciation simulation to understand the impact of the gradual increase in boreal summer insolation, CO2, and freshwater fluxes in the northern North Atlantic. And they show that in order to simulate like the abrupt transition of the AMOC during the last deglaciation, the balance of the meltwater flux in the north, as well as the warming over the Southern Ocean, could be very important. So again, emphasizing the role of the balance of the north and the south. Finally, after doing this type of sensitivity experiments and having more computational resources, some modeling centers were able to do like a long integration in a fixed experimental design, like the LGM or like other similar glacial boundary conditions. And this allowed some modeling groups to obtain geo-like climate variability, one of which first appeared about a decade ago using CCSM4, showing AMOC oscillations on a multi-centennial timescale. Followed by this work, there have been like other models showing like different types of millennial climate variability, some of which are published in Climate of the Past. So yeah, so it's really a nice thing to see like lots of different types of DO simulated in different models. And I'm not trying to say like which model is good and other models are bad, but I think like the different shapes in each simulated DO may reflect different important mechanisms controlling the periodicity and others. And thinking about the large diversity in the observed geocycles, maybe like each model is one of the realization of the real Danske-Rossige cycles. So understanding the cause of the differences in the shape of the geocycles among models might also help to understand the real observed geocycles and its diversity. So in this regard, quite a few studies have been trying to understand the driving mechanisms of the Danske-Rossige cycles or millennial climate variability. And there are lots of papers now, and also a review paper published in Climate of the Past 2 years ago. And here I just want to focus on the thermal component of the mechanism because, there are so many important mechanisms that can drive the geocycles, but probably I won't have enough time explaining them all. So thinking about the thermal component, let's start from the interstadial with the strong AMOC phase. During this phase, we have like a strong northward current that carries salty water from the subtropics and warms the Greenland. During this period, the intense surface cooling by the relatively colder atmosphere allows some formation of the deep water. So this surface cold water starts to sink to the subsurface and deep ocean. As a result, as the time goes, we will have more colder subsurface and deep ocean. In addition to this, we can also have a southward expansion of the Arctic sea ice, some of them covering the deepwater formation region. Together with the cooling of the deep and subsurface ocean, the southward expansion sea ice will also try to weaken the oceanic sinking at the deepwater formation and may cause the weakening of the AMOC. This mechanism itself has been referred to as the deep decoupling mechanism. So basically, like previous studies have focused on the effect of the Atlantic processes in driving the Danske-Rossige cycles, which makes sense. But like thinking about the time scale of millennia, I'm thinking about like past works suggesting the importance of the Southern Ocean, especially for the last deglaciation. One may argue that maybe the Southern Ocean can also have an effect for the intrinsic DO-like oscillations obtained from climate models. So coming back to my first ultimate questions, so as a community, I think we want to understand what's driving the DO cycles, or at least what's driving the models' DO-like behavior. And also what's the cause of the large diversity in the frequency of the observed DOs. And in order to understand these questions, we first have to understand what's going on in each model. So for this particular study, we focus on the role of the Southern Ocean feedback in affecting the DO-like climate variability. Okay, so we performed several climate simulations with a complex climate model, MyRock4M, which was used for IPCC AR4. So it's a slightly old model, but contains some important and complicated physics. The model consists of mainly two components, the atmosphere and the ocean. And the atmosphere has a resolution of 300 kilometers, while the ocean has a resolution of 100 kilometers. These two components are coupled through a coupler, which exchanges the heat, fresh water, and wind. Using the model, we integrated under the mid-glacial boundary condition, for example, the CO2 of 240 ppm for 10,000 years, and see what happens. Also, so in order to understand the individual effect of the Southern Ocean feedback, we had to do some sensitivity experiments isolating its effect. And in this regard, we modified some parts of the model's source code in the coupler so that we can control the magnitude of the fluxes and its exchange between the atmosphere and ocean. The method itself is published in my paper in Climate of the Past 4 years ago. So what we did is sometimes if we want to remove a particular feedback, we replace some of the fluxes, or we change the magnitude of some of the fluxes so that we can stop the effect of the feedback from affecting the AMOC. Okay. And in general, this kind of experiment itself has been applied to understand the dynamics of ENSO, or like Pacific decadal variability. Okay, I'll come back to this point later in more detail. Okay. So finally, here shows the simulated millennial climate variability obtained from MARC 4M. The top figure shows the time series of Greenland and Antarctic temperatures, and the bottom two panels show the spatial anomaly of temperature and precipitation compared to the 10,000-year mean. Okay. So during the interstadial, we can see a warm condition over the northern hemisphere, while gradual cooling over the Southern Ocean and Antarctica, similar to the bipolar seesaw. Once the climate shifts into the stadial, we can see a drastic cooling and a southward shift of the ITCZ, consistent with previous works. This climate variability itself is strongly connected to the variability in the AMOC. The bottom figure shows the spatial pattern of the AMOC, and during stadial, we can see a weaker AMOC and weaker and shallower AMOC. On the other hand, we can also find a northward intrusion of the Antarctic bottom water. Once the AMOC shifts into the interstadial, we can see the abrupt intensification of the AMOC and also deeper AMOC. So these large climate and AMOC changes are also consistent with drastic changes in the sea ice in the northern North Atlantic and oceanic heat content. Figure on the left shows the stadial annual mean sea ice fraction, and figure on the right shows that for the interstadial. During the stadial, we see a southward expansion of sea ice reaching the northern France, whereas once the AMOC intensifies, we can see a retreat of sea ice edge at higher latitudes around the southern Norwegian Sea. On the other hand, during the interstadial, we see ocean cooling. So here shows the anomaly of the oceanic temperature between the interstadial and all-year mean. Due to the intense formation of deep water, we have a strong downward movement of the ocean, cooling the subsurface ocean temperature. But interestingly, we can also see a substantial cooling at the deep ocean. And we wanted to know more about what's happening in the deep ocean, because previous study mainly focused on the subsurface ocean temperature changes. So we calculated the time series of the temperature change at the subsurface and the deep ocean. Here shows the time series of the AMOC on the top, subsurface ocean temperature over the NADW formation region in the middle, and deep ocean temperature at over the NADW formation region. So at the onset of the AMOC intensification, we can see a rapid cooling of the subsurface ocean temperature related to the sinking of the very cold surface water, followed by a gradual cooling with a magnitude of less than a degree. What's interesting is the deep ocean temperature change. At the onset of the AMOC intensification, we see abrupt warming, which is because of the replacement of the cold Antarctic bottom water to the warm, relatively warm NADW. However, after this shift from the ABW to NADW water, we can see a stronger and gradual cooling over the interstadial on a millennial timescale. So this type of oceanic cooling will try to increase the oceanic density at the deep ocean and may try to prohibit the deep water formation from happening. So we wanted to know more about what's the cause, what's the origin of this deep ocean temperature trend. In order to evaluate this, we created an animation of the density anomaly starting from year 4000, so the onset of the interstadial. Okay, so the red means dense, blue means light. So at the onset of the interstadial, we don't see much density anomaly, but as the time goes, we can see an increase in Southern Ocean surface density, which sinks and intrudes to the northern North Atlantic, increasing the density over the NADW formation region. So the gradual trend in the deep ocean observed in the model basically comes from the Southern Ocean. And from the analysis, we find that this gradual trend in the deep ocean and the Southern Ocean density increase is related to the bipolar seesaw. The figure on the top shows the time series of the AMOC, Antarctic temperature in the middle, and coastal sea ice formation around the Antarctica. At the onset of the AMOC intensification and interstadial, we see a gradual cooling of the Southern Ocean and Antarctica, known as the bipolar seesaw. This cooling allows more sea ice formation at the coast and tries to increase the density of the Antarctic bottom water. So from this analysis, we can kind of guess a positive, we can guess a potential negative feedback like this. Once the AMOC intensifies, that cools the Antarctic. Colder Antarctic then allows more sea ice formation and increases the deep water formation. Once the deep ocean gets dense enough, then it gets harder for the AMOC to sink, making the AMOC weaker. So this Southern Ocean feedback tries to weaken the AMOC on a millennial timescale. So once the AMOC intensifies, the Southern Ocean feedback tries to weaken the AMOC on a millennial timescale. But I mean, this argument is very qualitative, and we wanted to go a bit more farther. So we did like a so-called nudging sensitivity experiments, trying to control the strength of the Southern Ocean feedback. So again, here shows the time series of the coastal sea ice formation around the Antarctica. During the interstadial, we can see a gradual increase in sea ice formation. In one experiment shown in red, we increased the magnitude of the feedback. In another experiment, we reduced the magnitude of this feedback in a realistic framework. This was done by calculating this equation. So the F-sim means the simulated freshwater flux in the original simulation, and the FW target means the target climatology of the freshwater or sea ice formation, shown in the dashed line in these two figures. So in the experiment, we replaced half of the original fluxes calculated in the simulation to that of the target climatology. So in this way, we can control the magnitude of the Southern Ocean sea ice formation feedback. And we find that this Southern Ocean feedback actually plays a very important role in sustaining the DO-like climate variability in our model. So here the blue line shows the experiment with the weakened feedback, showing a stable interstadial state, whereas with the stronger feedback, we can see an earlier tipping of the climate into the stadial. One important thing we want to mention is that even with the stronger feedback, it takes more than 1,000 years. So one takeaway is that the Southern Ocean feedback plays a role in sustaining the climate variability, but only from a millennial timescale, because it's going to take a while for the Southern Ocean response to reach the northern North Atlantic. How does the Southern Ocean feedback modify the AMOC then? In order to understand this, we have two processes are important. The first process is the increase in the Antarctic bottom water density. So this figure is comparing the density anomaly between the two nudging experiments after 1,000 years of integration, shown in this vertical gray line. So the red is from the strong and the blue is from the weak. So when we compare the strong minus weak, we can see a denser Antarctic bottom water reaching the northern high latitude at the deep ocean, which is related to more brine rejection over the Southern Ocean. As a result, this causes a gradual shoaling of the AMOC and starts to replace some of the relatively warm NADW to relatively cold Antarctic bottom water. As a result, what's happening in the deep ocean over the NADW formation region is a stronger cooling. With the stronger Southern Ocean feedback, we can see a stronger cooling in this region, whereas with the weakened feedback, we don't see much of a gradual cooling afterwards. So basically, the Southern Ocean feedback controls the deep ocean temperature, so the oceanic heat content over the NADW formation region, and affect the AMOC. Okay, so to summarize, we have examined the effect of the Southern Ocean feedback through some nudging experiments and show that this feedback is in fact important in sustaining paleoclimate variability. And I think this Southern Ocean feedback is compatible with other feedbacks in the North Atlantic. For example, the mechanism of the Southern Ocean feedback quite resembles the decoupling, but happening at greater depth. And usually when the AMOC weakens, these two, like North Atlantic feedback, operates first. And sometimes these negative feedbacks are sufficient to kick in some of the positive feedbacks to cause the abrupt transition. However, in some cases, maybe these Atlantic feedbacks are not quite enough to tip the system. And in that kind of situation, the gradual push from the Southern Ocean feedback can help the system go beyond the tipping point and cause a positive feedback and initiate the drastic reorganization of the AMOC. And in particular, we think that the Southern Ocean feedback would be important for DOs with long periodicity, such as those happening after the Heinrich events in MIS3, or those happening during the MIS5. But we still have to do more detailed simulations to really clarify this point. Okay. I'm not sure if I have some time left, but maybe I just go through this slide quickly. So one of the advantages of using complex climate model is it calculates the responses of the atmospheric circulation to AMOC changes reasonably well. And some of the previous studies also suggested a strong link between the AMOC strength and the surface wind over the North Atlantic. For example, when the AMOC is in the strong state, people have shown that the surface wind over the North Atlantic also becomes strong. Whereas when the AMOC is in the weak state, the surface wind also weakens. And we wanted to know how this wind AMOC feedback affects the shape of the downscale Oscigo cycles simulated in MAROC 4M. So we did like a sensitivity experiments fixing the surface wind in a different experimental setup. And this is the obtained AMOC time series. And it's showing the AMOC evolution for 3,000 years. And we have like some tipping with the periodicity of multi-centennial. So this result also suggests that the atmosphere wind feedback can also modulate the shape of the AMOC, which might be important in understanding the diversity in the simulated shape for each model. Okay. So to conclude, we have performed some nudging or partially coupled experiments to understand the quantitative importance of each feedback in help driving the millennial climate variability. And as one of the demonstrations, we showed the importance of the Southern Ocean feedback. And in the last few slides, we also showed some of the effects from the North Atlantic surface wind in affecting the shape of the AMOC. But I think the most important takeaway from this presentation is like doing this kind of nudging or partially coupled sensitivity experiment is really important if we want to understand what's causing the difference among models. Okay. So I'd like to finish my talk here, and I would be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sam. We have some time for questions, and I think since we have a relatively small group of people here, if you'd like to ask a question, you can just raise your hand and either unmute yourself, or if you don't want to unmute yourself, you can type your question into the chat. Questions for either Helen or Sam? Lori?
Yeah, maybe I'll start the question then. Thank you so much, Helen and Sam, for your talks. That was very interesting. Maybe I'll start with Sam since since you are online, maybe easier. Yeah, this is quite fascinating. I think I really like this feedback, and I think it makes sense. And the difference in density between ABW and ADDW has been mentioned, for a few years, but sometimes I feel like we're kind of missing a really process understanding of, or really, proof of concept. So I think it's great, but I was just wondering, when you were showing your density plots,
Yep.
I mean, there's clear difference in between, your ABW in the Southern Ocean and the North Atlantic. But when you actually look into the North Atlantic section, it's not that obvious. I was wondering if you were to plot, a density profile
yeah.
in the North Atlantic, do you actually see this effect?
So can you see my screen?
Yeah.
So do you mean by this figure or?
Yeah, I was meaning here. So, I guess maybe it also depends where your deep water is formed.
Yeah.
But basically the change in vertical density gradient in
Yeah.
your water formation region, how
Yeah.
does it look like?
So I think you can see the positive density anomaly being like diffused in the northern North Atlantic, but the anomaly like kind of gets weaker as it reaches the deep water formation region, I guess. And there are two reasons for this. So the first reason is, maybe I should share my pointer. So this bit is corresponds to the bottom end of the NADW cell. So the ABW is reaching until here, and then afterwards there's a mixing of the NADW and the ABW in this region. And yeah, so that's why we don't see much of a large density anomaly in this region. But what's actually happening in this region is that I don't have a figure now, but we can see I saw a gradual shoaling of the AMOC in this latitude, which means more influence from the Antarctic bottom water. And once we have like more Antarctic bottom water, we have like a colder water, like reaching the deep water formation region, like until the 50 or 60 degrees north. And that's affecting the deep ocean, that's affecting the oceanic heat content of the deep water. But interestingly, we don't see like a large density trend again here. And this is because of the mixture of like cold and fresh Antarctic bottom water with warm and salty NADW. And somehow the mixture kind of cancel out the density trend, but at least the oceanic temperature here is reducing. And once you have like a colder water here, that will try to reduce the amount of the heat release at the oceanic surface. So it gets harder for the AMOC to maintain the strong AMOC. And yeah, so maybe my explanation was a bit complicated, but that could be one explanation. Would that be okay, or am I making any sense?
No, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you. I think yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm looking forward to looking at more results on that. I think it's exciting. So maybe I'll just ask a quick question to Ellen then on the Delta 13C. So thank you. I think it's really exciting to be able to use those Planktic delta C13 records. And there's some potential, I think, with using model as well to try and deconvolve the different processes. But I was wondering if you think that then in some regions, this Planktic delta C13 can be just simply a proxy for surface productivity, or is that what maybe you could be used for?
So I think different regions are being dominated by these very different processes. So that's what we were trying to do there by deconvolving the air-sea influence versus the biological influence. And in some regions, the biological influence is the dominant one, which is going to tell you very much about the productivity. Whereas across that Southwest Pacific, we basically go from a productivity-dominated region to an air-sea flux-dominated region to, as we go south, an influence of the upwelling of the deep waters. So you've got these three different regimes that are dominated by different processes. The carbon isotopes are dominated by different processes. So yeah, different regions will be dominated by different parts of that carbon process that is dominating the signal. So yeah, absolutely.
Any questions from the rest of the audience here?
I have a question to Helen, actually.
Great.
I really like your deglaciation curve, showing the changes in the latitudinal band of the upwelling, I guess. I was wondering how fine a resolution you can go with that kind of data. Can you I'm sure it's gonna take some time to do high resolution analysis, but would you be able to do a reconstruction of the BA and younger Dryas, that kind of time scale, or maybe even fine time resolution?
I guess if you get a really good core with high resolution sedimentation rates, then absolutely. What I was really hoping to show was some new data from MIS3 from this region that we're currently running in the lab, but unfortunately the machine has had some downtime. It needs a bit of a fix because I was hoping to show some millennial scale Delta 13C records, which we have some, but I wanted to do higher resolution in between because it's at low resolution at the moment. So we're doing higher resolution. But absolutely, Julia Gottschalk in her 2015 paper had millennial scale carbon fluxes from the Southern Ocean in the South Atlantic, showing that you could see the clear upwelling and air-sea exchange during AIM events when we get the CO2 pulses into the atmosphere. So yeah, it would be great to get another high-resolution record from the Southern Ocean that covers longer time periods and a high resolution to try and tease out more those processes, those air-sea flux processes across those deglacial and millennial scale DO, Heinrich, AIM event type features. Yeah, so that's been on the ultimate wish list.
Sounds exciting, and yeah, hope I can see the data soon.
So, Sam, I have a question for you. So you mentioned the North Atlantic winds. Have you taken a look at the Southern Hemisphere winds on the interstadial stadial transitions?
Very good question. So I think proxy data suggests a northward shift of the Southern Ocean winds during interstadial and a southward shift during stadial. Am I right? Maybe no? Okay, yeah. There's an expert, so yeah. So that can also affect the AMOC by changing the magnitude of the upwelling and the soil transport to the AMOC. Unfortunately, most of the models are not really good at simulating a meridional migration of the Southern Ocean winds in response to AMOC changes in the AMOC. because the model's Southern Ocean Westerly is too stable, maybe because of low resolution in the atmospheric model. So in our model, we only see like maybe 0.5 meter per sec changes in the wind, which is a bit of a shame. But like if we use like a higher resolution atmospheric model, we would be able to investigate that kind of effect as well. And in fact, there are some like studies using EMIC, changing like the latitudinal location of the westerly wind, like mimicking DO cycles, and they showed the meridional shift in the Southern Ocean wind can kind of drive the millennial climate variability. So like combining the sea ice feedback and the Southern Ocean wind feedback would be quite important. And I think they reinforce together each other. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
So I have a question, Sam. It's Dennis. So can you elaborate this wind story in Northern Hemisphere? Because
no. Yeah. Maybe I should share my screen then. Sorry, I didn't have much time left to. So the thing is, there have been some studies first using like a simple climate model, followed by Shuzan's 2014 Nature paper showing some changes in the surface wind related to the AMOC changes. And once when you have a stronger AMOC, that creates like a sea ice free condition in the northern North Atlantic, and which will release some oceanic heat to the atmosphere. And that will try to intensify the cyclonic circulation, so the Icelandic low in this region. So this means like the strong AMOC initiates stronger surface wind, and usually when the surface wind is stronger, that transports saline water from the subtropics to the high latitude, making the high latitude saltier. So it kind of maintains the strong AMOC. And once the AMOC gets weaker, then we can see some expansion of the sea ice, creating like a weakening of the Icelandic low, or like creating a high pressure anomaly over the surface. And once the wind gets weaker, that will also weaken the northward salt transport, so maintain the weak AMOC by reducing the salinity at higher latitude. And if we switch off this kind of positive feedback, then we get like a shorter duration for each mode. Example, so usually Maroc tends to simulate like DO cycles with long integration, like 1500 years to 5000 years. But without the wind feedback, the model is also able to simulate like a centennial timescale or AMOC variability. So the duration of each mode reduces to less than 500 years or less. Yeah, less than 500 years. So at least for Maroc, like having the positive wind AMOC feedback kind of tries to increase the duration of the AMOC variability, increase the periodicity of the AMOC variability. But again, like when we think about the total frequency of AMOC variability, it's created by a combination of like many other feedbacks, like the salt oscillator, deep decoupling, Southern Ocean, atmosphere, ocean interaction, salt advection. And each model, like the magnitude of each feedback differs. So we get like different shapes in the simulated DOs, or different periodicity in each simulated DO cycles. Maybe I talk too much, but is that okay?
No, yeah, it's okay.
Thank you for the question.
All right. I think thank you for those of you who attended, and thank you again to our speakers for a couple really exciting talks.
Yes, thank you very much. I also want to add that the next webinar, the next Climate of the Past webinar will be on Wednesday, 14th of January, so next year, and it will be on paleoclimate history. So some announcement will be made by email, but also on the EGU webpage. Correct, Denis?
Yes, very soon when everything is set, yes.
So thanks again to all of you. Thanks again for great talks. And yes, we will also make the announcement when the recording is available on YouTube.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.